Welcome back, everyone, to Relate Humanly. I'm Rob Nuttleman. I'm glad you made it. Today, we're talking with Cara Trapani. Cara is a partner at Bueller Trapani LLP. They're one of Northern California's oldest workplace investigation law firms. Cara has significant experience investigating allegations of discrimination, harassment, retaliation, and other misconduct, both in the workplace as well as in educational institutions under Title IX. She's got a deep understanding of workplace dynamics, human experiences, and how we perceive and communicate information. Her dedication to fostering healthy workplaces led to going from being an attorney to a workplace investigator, and truly does a wonderful job. Before co-founding Bueller Trapani, Cara litigated civil rights and employment matters in litigation firm in San Francisco. So it's been great that she made that transition to being a workplace investigator. So with no further ado, have a nice cup of coffee, drink water, whatever you'd like. Sit back and enjoy. Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited you're here. Today, we're going to be talking with Cara Trapani.
Hi, everyone. Super excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Rob.
So I met Cara, I don't know, about a year ago or so. Like shortly after I met her, I had a client that needed a workplace investigation. And so I called her up, and the client was, by the way, exceedingly happy with the services your firm provided. But tell me, how did you become a workplace investigator?
Well, thanks for those kind words, Rob. And yeah, it was a really circuitous route for me. I studied anthropology in college, in undergrad, and I've always been interested in humans, how we communicate with each other, how we relate to people, stories. I took this mythology class in my first year of undergrad, and it was just one of those course requirements, but I was fascinated by it. And then I found out, oh, I could major by taking classes like this. Great.
So
And then I took
like
this.
mythology, like Greek mythology, Roman mythology, other types of mythology, or
It started out with a quarter on Greek mythology. So I was learning all about ancient Greece and different, the more detailed version of Hercules that I watched as a kid. And then my second class, the next round, was more focused on LA and the mythology of Los Angeles, specifically during the civil rights era and the Rodney King and Watts uprisings. And it was so interesting to hear from perspectives of people. My professors had lived in LA during that time, and kind of seeing how storytelling and human experience could be translated from the study of these ancient times to being more contemporary. I loved that aspect. And the through line was, yeah, storytelling, humans, how we relate to each other, all that kind of stuff.
that's interesting because I always think of mythology as in cultural mythology from way back when, forgetting about the fact that we're creating mythology kind of even today in our interactions. And so a more modern day mythology, that's interesting. And so that's what's got you into anthropology in general, or were you already studying anthropology?
No, that was my first foray into anthropology. It was that kind of selection of courses was brought together by a bunch of anthropology professors. I was at UCLA at the time. And so I was like, let me just take more of these classes. They're so interesting. And then I got into a linguistic anthropology class my next year, which was all about how do people show up in different spaces based on their context, based on the languages they speak. Do they speak in their native language when they're with certain people or just in certain topic areas of conversation? So all of that stuff, I studied that and was really fascinated by that too. And
So
it kind of helped.
you're looking at like how people are communicating. I may be using certain words based on my culture, my background, my language, which might not be how you're hearing it necessarily, and understanding how those may differ.
Yeah, exactly. Both in conflict. So times when people are not communicating well. So if you're, coming from two different cultural backgrounds, maybe you don't speak the same language as someone, the way that you enter a conversation, whether it be your body language, your word choices, your pauses between listening, your acknowledgments, nodding your head while someone's communicating versus not. Maybe you show more of a deferential style in those kind of communications. So that part, the conflict part, and how missed mismatched or misaligned kind of cultural tendencies can show up in different ways to create conflict, but also in relations to each other too, and how you can build rapport and build friendship and build trust by acknowledging some of those different ways that you code switch. For example, if you are bilingual and you code switch to greet someone in a language that they speak. That instantly builds rapport with someone and builds trust and ties you together. So it was
So,
all things like that.
well, code switch, explain that, what that means.
Yes. Okay. Code switching is this concept that you have a different way of communicating in different contexts. So, the most basic form is if you speak more than one language, you might quote unquote code switch by changing your actual language that you're speaking in. But another way you could code switch is, say you're in the workplace, you put on a certain guise or persona. For me, when I was in litigation, I felt like I was constantly code switching into this more hardened kind of um uber professional, serious persona whenever I was with certain clients, in front of a judge, in front of very senior partners or colleagues. And it didn't always feel authentic to me, but it felt like, okay, this is how I need to show up in this moment. So I'm going to code switch into this. And I think it shows up for different people in different ways.
So changing how I'm speaking, mannerisms, how I'm presenting to fit the situation that as I perceive it.
Yeah, exactly. And that can come with, you know, so much of that is around implicit bias and the things that people from all different types of identity categories face to, like I said, create that can cause tension or more burden on people from different minority backgrounds. But it's also a beautiful way that you can build community and build rapport by showing people different ways that you're actually more similar than different.
Okay, so using that code switching as a way to just to make those connections and well, like you say, build the rapport. I like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So
So I would
you're learning about these, and you were did you go in school in Southern California
I
or
did, yeah, I was at school at UCLA, and
go?
I was in a new city, loved it there. I was exploring, I was so naturally curious, and so again, I was taking these classes that I was like, "Oh, I never thought you could study any of this," having a great time. I studied abroad, and then when I realized that I wanted to go into law school, I was thinking I'll do some civil rights work, I'll work with kids or maybe do some international human rights type of work. And then I got to law school and I interned with this civil rights firm down in SoCal that was representing people in the LA County jail system to improve the conditions they were living in while they were either waiting for trial or had already been sentenced. And I was so passionate about learning about their lived experiences, finding out how horrible the conditions were. And it just kind of launched me onto this path of civil rights work focusing on incarcerated people. And so that's what I did for a long time after graduating law school. And in the course of that, also picked up some employment law work. So it was a bit, like I said, a circuitous route for me, but the through line was always super interested in hearing people's different ways of experiencing life, relating to humans, people who are different from me, learning that we're all really similar at the core, and that, sometimes people just get handed different opportunities and different hardships in their life, and we're all just trying to do our best. And how can I, bring some positivity or support to those situations? And yeah, I didn't even know what workplace investigations was when I
Well, it
graduated
sounds like
law
yeah,
school.
it sounds like that common thread though,
Mhm.
whether it was in school, I assume even probably in some of your travels, but in the work is this how, how am I perceiving where I am? How am I using that? How is that impacting me? my relationship with other people. And I can imagine some of the difficult cases in civil rights in the jails in particular. And as an employment attorney myself, I know that very well about hearing people's story and giving people the opportunity to tell their story can be very empowering. And as an attorney, it's a wonderful thing to be able to give people that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I had this professor in law school, Gerald Lopez. He's a prolific person in the critical race theory and critical race studies background. And he taught about rebellious lawyering, which is this concept of not necessarily coming in as the outside lawyer to come and save whatever community that needs your support or your assistance. Rather, you're coming in more of a translator. The
Hmm.
community you're serving, your clients you're serving, they already know what they need. You don't need to teach them what they need. They are the experts. They're the sources of truth for all of that. All you're doing as a lawyer when you're practicing rebelliously is translating what they need and what they want into this corporate context of the law that we've created with all of our jurisprudence and all of the traditions that we have in filing briefs, writing in a certain way, speaking to judges in a certain way, and opposing counsel. But at the core, you're always coming back to your client. You're always trying to uplift their voice and their story in your advocacy. So I've always tried to do that too.
I mean, and that's such a, I think that that's when attorneys are really at their best. Uh, I may have my idea on how a matter should proceed or how a matter should resolve, et cetera. And I've really learned as a mediator, it's not about what I think it should be. It's how do I help the parties get to where they need to be so the resolution is there? How do I empower them so that they can have a voice for what they need, not necessarily what I think they might need.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of tension between this concept for lawyers like you and me who have this high empathy meter where sometimes our tendency is to come in and hear people's problems. I mean, even in my personal life, I do this all the time. And my mode is always like, oh, how can I fix it? How can I help? What can I do? Okay, let's go, go, go. And I have learned through my work as a workplace investigator and also becoming a supervisor. I own this firm now that's growing and I'm managing my own staff. Of it's more about being curious. It's more about pausing and letting people who you work with, whether it's in work or your personal relationships, find out what they need from their own internal kind of moment of reflection. And you can always ask questions. That's what you do in your mediation work. You can ask questions, you can get people in the right headspace to make those decisions and gain those insights. But at the core, it has to come from them. It can't come from the outside. It's not going to be effective.
That be curious is such an important concept and can be difficult. And what's interesting is, I don't know about you, but it's easy for me to be curious with my clients or, the parties that I'm mediating with. Other contexts, it's hard. Like if I'm talking to an opposing counsel,
Mm.
even though being curious could be helpful, or if I'm having a conversation with one of my children, where they need to be heard, and I'm in that solutions things. Do you when you're doing your investigations, do you ever have difficulty code switching to making sure that you are in that curiosity mode?
Yes, this is such a good point. I think one of the hardest things about workplace investigations is to keep that curiosity and that open mind throughout the process because generally, when we are entering an investigation, we start by interviewing the person who made the complaint. So we get their side of the story first. And then usually we're even getting the side of the story from the internal HR person who even hired us right before that. So we have this kind of preset idea of what may have happened. And then usually in workplace investigations, we're not talking yet to the person who allegedly perpetrated the harm. We call them the respondent. We talk to witnesses who may have overheard things. We review documents, and then at the very end of the process, we talk to the respondent. And so we're always having to fight that instinct of making assumptions about what happened or kind of, "Oh, okay, I'm setting up this story in my head. Yes, I'm going to follow my implicit biases and they're guiding me in one way. So I'm just going to go with that and not ask these other questions or interview these other three people who probably will say the same thing." Um, and that's a really difficult tension because you don't want to interview every single person and spend tons of money on an investigation. That's not what your clients need or want. And you're also not finding the truth of the matter as a workplace investigator. You're just finding out whether something happened more likely than not. That's another kind of misconception about our work. And so it's really hard, but you do have to just pause. It's why it's so good to have a team around you, whether it's coworkers or people who do this kind of work, to ask, like, hey, can I get a gut check on this? Am I making an assumption in not interviewing so and so? Do I really need to pause and reframe what's in my head before I go into that respondent interview? Am I asking all the right questions? Am I being open minded? Because you have to stay curious throughout the whole investigation. Otherwise, you're going to miss something.
Well, and I imagine the implicit bias is difficult. And I love the fact that you're using other people as one of the tools to identify, am I having this bias? Because the problem with implicit or subconscious biases is we don't necessarily know them. If we're at least aware that, okay, I likely have some, let's figure out if I do, then you can come up with ways to not react or respond to them. How difficult is that for you to be able to recognize a possible implicit bias that you might have?
It can be really difficult, but practice has been the key thing for me of just always coming back to, okay, let me take off my neutral hat, my investigator hat, and put on my plaintiff's attorney hat. Am I missing something that I would be advocating for if I was representing the party bringing this complaint? And then I stop and try to pause and think the other side. Okay, if I was defending the employer, if this came to litigation, what would they be arguing in front of a judge right now about my investigation? Would they be saying, "Oh, this is, not thorough because she didn't review whatever personnel file or request some copy of a complaint that was investigated 2 years ago?" So I'm always trying to pressure test my assumptions, my findings based on those kind of internal monologues. And then again, yeah, going to other people is the most helpful thing because especially when you're surrounded by other curious workplace investigators, we're just naturally like, "Oh, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that?" Or I wonder if your identity is coming into play or this or your lived experience. I mean, for me, I just had a kid and I am very partial to moms coming back to work from maternity leave. I was there a year ago, so I know what that feels like. And I really have to be careful that I'm not putting more weight on their statements in my investigations because I've had that shared lived experience so recently.
You so much you said there it triggers a lot of things. One, the putting yourself in the other person's shoes, asking, okay, if I was the employee or the complainant or reporter, or if I was the respondent, what would they be thinking? And not stopping just by asking what one side might be, or what am I missing there? But doing both sides, I can see how that helps eliminate some of that implicit bias. When particularly early on and I still do it, but I it's more innate now. When I get a case, I actually start looking for the other side's case. What's going to help the other side first, as just a way for me to understand their position before I necessarily jump right into, oh, we're always right. It's like, what is the evidence going to show? The other thing that I thought was interesting is you talked about not finding. It's not about finding the truth. It's about what was the phrase? Preponderance
Like
of the
more,
evidence, I think is
yeah,
a good way of saying it.
preponderance. Mhm.
Explain that a little bit more.
Yeah. So, as workplace investigators, our mandate is to find out whether something happened by a preponderance of the evidence. And that's a legal standard. But what it really means is that is it 50% and a feather more likely that it happened the way that it was alleged, or did it happen some other way? And so we use the term more likely than not to kind of express that in a colloquial way. And yeah, it can be really hard to explain to the people who are participating in the investigation, but we always try to let folks know that right up front because, I think sometimes when you make a complaint at work, maybe rightfully so, you're like, okay, someone's going to look into this and get to the bottom of it and find every single detail that happened and, say exactly who said what in this meeting, what they said behind closed doors, and this investigator is going to come through and uncover all of that. And it's just not possible. There's so many different experiences by the people who witnessed things, who interpreted it differently. We can review Slack messages, Teams messages, calendar invitations. We can look at audio recordings of meetings, but at the end of the day, we can't recreate exactly precisely what happened because we weren't there. And it's where we call them credibility factors, come into play in our work. There's these set of factors that all workplace investigators look to try to make sure that we are weighing the evidence in a way that tries to get to that preponderance as best we can. So that's, looking at whether people are making consistent statements with other witnesses, whether what they're saying is corroborated by documentation, whether the person who's sharing something with us might have some kind of motive to frame their statements in a certain way or fabricate something or exaggerate something. So, yeah, there's a whole list of things that we look to help with that.
And those credibility determinations can be difficult. I mean, like our judicial system, we're set up with you have a right to a jury, or sometimes you're just going to be in front of a judge or an arbitrator, and they're going to be making a decision. Do you ever feel like an inordinate amount of pressure as a workplace investigator to get it right?
Yeah, I really do. We're not human lie detectors. No one is. Everyone's coming to their experiences with their own implicit biases, and even workplace investigators who are highly trained and skilled at checking those biases, we still have them. And so having those factors to come back to and just literally I'd go down the list of all 10 of them every time I'm doing a really tricky credibility assessment and think through, okay, am I factoring in all of these things just to make sure I'm not missing something. And one thing that I was surprised when I first, converted into this career of workplace investigations was that looking at people's demeanor, like their body language, whether they're crossing their arms, whether they're shifting their eyes back and forth, that's actually a terrible credibility factor to rely on.
Tell me about that.
And and we're trained not to rely on that. We call it demeanor evidence because people can show up in these interviews in a variety of ways for a variety of reasons. And a lot of that comes down to meeting with a lawyer and being intimidated or nervous, even if you really did experience sexual harassment in your workplace. If you're talking to someone, a complete stranger who you don't know, they're an outside attorney, that they're, contracted with your HR department, it can be really nerve-wracking, and you might come into that interview shifting your body or looking to the side while you're talking to me on screen or in person, and that doesn't mean that you're not expressing the truth of what happened from your perspective.
I
And
Yeah, I read an article a couple years ago because you were talking about the 10 years ago investigations, it was all in person, right? We're doing in
Mhm.
person. And then with the pandemic and the better technology that we have that we can do via video calls, more and more people are doing it, doing investigations, video or phone. And some investigators actually prefer not to have the visual as it can eliminate that. What was the phrase you used? The demeanor.
Demeanor. Mhm.
Yeah.
Interesting. I still do really like to have video when I can swing it, though I always ask people if they need an accommodation, and some folks do ask to go off of video because for various reasons they might be able to focus better on questions of having no video on. But for me, it's not so much to determine credibility, but as to build rapport. I think when you're able to look someone in the eyes, whether it's through a screen or in person, you are able to read their cues, their communication cues, and better meet them where they're at and build that trust, build rapport through acknowledging, hey, do you need a break right now? Or I see this is difficult for you. Do you want to pause and drink some water and come back in 5 minutes? And those are the little tricks, or not tricks, but those are the little things you can do to build comfort and build trust and help people open up. Because at
Well,
the end
yeah,
of the day, that's what you need to do
yeah,
as
and you're showing empathy and you're showing understanding. And now you do not just workplace investigations, but also Title IX investigations.
yeah, that's right. We do Title IX investigations at my firm too. And
Explain Title IX in a few sentences for those.
yeah, I will.
Currently.
So for me, before I came into this world, Title IX to me meant, oh, okay, women on the women's soccer team at my university should get the same resources as the men's soccer team, right? That's kind of how Title IX is understood in kind of the modern world. And there's this other part of Title IX that prevents all kinds of sexual discrimination in schools and higher education. And it actually applies to schools that receive federal funding, regardless of whether you're in a university setting or even K through 12. And most schools do receive some kind of federal funding, and Title IX applies. And the way that it comes in for our work is that anytime someone, a student, someone who works at it, an education institution, files a complaint related to sexual harassment or discrimination based on sex, then that will trigger a Title IX complaint process. And without getting into too many details, that requires a neutral investigation. And so we will come in and do the neutral investigation for those kinds of complaints. But in reality, it's very similar to the work that we do in our workplace investigations context, where we're interviewing people, finding out what happened, reviewing documents, and then providing some kind of written report back to the institution or the K through 12 district to hopefully help them decide what to do next.
So the process is similar. Is a standard pretty much similar? You're still dealing with the same type of anti-harassment, anti-discrimination laws that might be in the employment, and you're still using preponderance of the evidence. You're still kind of the same standards.
Yeah, same standards. We're still using the same credibility factors. One Title IX matter that recently wrapped up in our firm was between two college students who had been intoxicated, and there was a sexual encounter between them. And the complaint was that it was unwanted sexual touching. And so we investigated those two parties that complaint by interviewing the two parties, witnesses who were at the party, and ultimately providing a report to describe everything that we found.
I've done workplace investigations. I've never done one in the school setting.
Mm.
Um, I've always assumed that it was somewhat similar, but having never done one, so thank you for that. So, if there was one thing, let's say you could talk to a room of people who are eventually going to be involved in an investigation, whether it's as a respondent or as somebody who's reporting it, or maybe just as a witness. Is there any advice you would give them on how to help that process as much as possible?
Yeah, I think for this one, I'll go back to where I started and give a little bit of myth busting. So I think the main thing that I would want to convey to anyone who is participating in a workplace investigation where there's an outside attorney like me coming in to interview you is that we really do not have a stake in the outcome. Most of the time, my clients are employers who I have never worked with and probably will never work with again. And it's really helpful because I don't know the context of your workplace and I don't know all the ins and outs and the baggage that may have happened. And I'm really coming to it with an open and curious mind to try to elevate the experience that you had and learn what happened to you from your perspective and be as, open-minded about that as I can. And so I really am not in the pocket of the employer, so to speak, or coming to a situation with a preconceived, predetermined outcome. When we're coming from the outside, it's really helpful that we can come to things with open eyes like that.
So really kind of re-emphasizing the neutrality and the, although I'm usually, I'm assuming paid by the employer to do the investigation or paid by the school to do the investigation. That doesn't mean that's not what's going to sway your decision.
That's right. Yeah, we do have a contract with the employer, with the school, but the contract itself says that our duty to our client is to be impartial. That is our contracted duty, and we have to uphold that. We could lose our, ability to do workplace investigations if we don't abide by that. And so it's very important. It's why we don't get involved in all the corrective action measures that come after a workplace investigation. It's why we bring people like you in, Rob, and people like the folks who have spoken on this podcast in the past to help mediate conflict or create healthier workplaces once the investigation is done. But yeah, we come in and just try to hear people's stories and really try to help them digest what happened, unpack it, unload it onto someone else who is really curious and wants to hear from you about what your experience was.
So it's interesting about the corrective action part, what are we going to do with the results of the investigation? And you're not having any part. Is there a party of like just wants to know, but hey, how did that all turn out? What was the end result? Or are you pretty much no? I'm done with my investigation. I'm on to the next.
Coming from an advocacy background, I thought I was going to be more upset by not being involved in that part than I am. And I still do have a lot of dreams for expanding our practice into some more of this restorative work. And I think the tension would be how can we provide that resource for people who we're not doing investigations for? Because I think things can get really sticky when you try to do that work for the same entity or, people that you were just investigating 2 weeks ago. But for the most part, I know my lane and I know the importance of my role in the process, which is to do the best that I can to provide an impartial investigation that's going to withstand scrutiny and, be impartial and neutral and fair to everyone. And so I just try to focus on how can I do that to the best of my ability and how can I find exactly the right people to bring in who can do that other work really effectively once my role is done.
My hat is off to you again. I've done workplace investigations here, there. I never do them for my clients for that same reason. Obviously I'm going to be biased towards my clients. Um, and since I represent employees and employers, I try to be as impartial as I can. I believe I've got some unique ways of perceiving it, but you have done countless more than I have, and your experience and knowledge just you bring such a wealth. I know I mentioned that you did an investigation for one of my clients, and the level of comfort that you bring by bringing in a professional. When the client has a lot of comfort knowing that you're a professional, this is what you do. And win, lose, or draw, or whatever it's going to be, whatever the outcome is, at least knowing what the facts are is going to help everybody make informed decisions going forward. So thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you. Yeah, likewise, right back at you, Rob. It's been a pleasure getting to know you, and the same way that you think of us for investigations, we think the same of you in the work that you do. I think even the fact that you're doing this podcast and talking about relating humanly to each other, I subscribe to that wholeheartedly. I think we can treat each other more like humans on a daily basis and recognize that we're all a lot more similar than we are different, and try to use those commonalities to bring more peace and harmony in the workplace rather than, more conflict, which unfortunately we see too much of.
And if people want to get in touch with you, btinvestigates.com.
That's right.
Is
B
it-
as in
is-
boy, T as in Tom, investigates.com.
As Bueller Trapani.
Yep, Bueller Trapani. You can also find my email, Cara, Cara, at btinvestigates.com. I love talking about this stuff and workplace investigations, human behavior generally. So hit me up if you want to continue the conversation.
Yeah, if you have questions, if you have need for a workplace investigation, or Title IX investigation, CAR is an excellent resource. If she's not available, she's got other wonderful investigators also within her firm, all with hours and hours of training and years of experience. They do a wonderful job. So, Cara, thank you once again for being a guest. Really appreciate you coming.
Thanks for having me. It was a blast.
And by the way, anybody listening to the podcast, speaking of subscribing to things, feel free to subscribe, hit your like button, costs you nothing, but it certainly helps us provide this great content to other people. Thank you very much, Cara. You have a great day.
Thanks. Take care, Rob.